Hello, everybody. Now I'm going to present to you the second and final part of Chapter 6, Cognitive Development in the First 2 Years. We're going to talk about communication and language development, one of my favorite topics, quite honestly. So it's pretty remarkable that as human beings, we develop the ability to share our internal experiences with other people through language, which is basically a symbolic system. So if we break this down developmentally, what is it that happens in the first 2 years of life? Well, before birth, there's actually been research that suggests that the developing fetus is learning some of the rudimentary structures of language by the way that the neural structures of the brain are being organized. So the fetus is still hearing information while inside the womb, and the sounds that are coming in actually direct certain resources within the brain and nervous system to build the architecture of the brain in a way that will be ready to process the sounds that the infant will hear once he or she is born. This is why the language spoken around a pregnant woman is actually going to lay down the architecture for the language for the baby to be born. So it is a pretty remarkable thing that happens at the earliest onset of being able to perceive sound. As a newborn, what we see is that little babies prefer speech sounds that come from their mother's language, those familiar things that helped build up the architecture. And gradually, they begin to be able to selectively attend to the sounds that come from the language that their family speaks. At around 6 months, the baby is actually able to distinguish a variety of sounds and gestures in his or her own language. So this is a remarkably plastic period in brain development where the inputs that are coming in from the external world have a lot to do with the development of the nervous system, especially those parts of the brain that help us understand and eventually express in a symbolic system that our family uses. So in the early stages of language development, we have a stage that we refer to as pre-linguistic. In other words, what do we learn about the process of communication from human being to human being before the full symbolic expressive language system kicks in? Well, it turns out infants and toddlers are using a variety of nonverbal behaviors to learn how to communicate. They begin to learn how to make noises that get increasingly differentiated across development. They use motor movements that become gestures that also communicate intent, such as eventually holding up one's arms to be picked up. And they understand and develop facial expressions that fit their culture. So smiling indicating happiness or pleasure, frowning indicating distaste. Now, while the timing of different steps in the language acquisition process is going to vary, the sequence or the order within which we learn each of these steps is thought to be universal. So regardless of the culture you go through, we all work through these increasingly differentiated sounds, gestures, facial expressions, and I would also add using eyes to communicate intention. We all do that across cultures. Once the language itself kicks in, that symbolic system, those things are going to differ based on the language of the family. So early on, newborns are also learning how to listen to the language around them as well as to send messages of communication. And studies have suggested that they prefer to listen to the language that is familiar to them, to the one that their mother spoke when they were in the womb. Newborns with bilingual mothers do show language preferences for the language they heard most. Child-directed speech is an important phenomena for encouraging this listening and responding. So child-directed speech is defined as a parent who uses short syllables, makes noises similar to what the infant might use, and directs that speech at the level of the baby's ability to understand. Simple phrases, melodic tones, and attention-getting kinds of sounds. Child-directed speech is associated with increases in the baby's ability to listen and respond. So what you might think of as baby talk or motherese, where we use this kind of high-pitched, simplified, and repetitive way of talking, that actually encourages listening in babies. It captures their attention. Another important part of learning how to understand the language around you has to do with habituation. This is when you are exposed to something over and over and over again, and then you become less interested in it because it's no longer novel. So the process of habituation is applicable to lots of things outside of language. So for example, think about motor skills. For a baby who's first learning how to put her hand on a table and pull to stand, those attempts to do that early on are really interesting because it's a new behavior. Over time, when the infant has done it and done it well hundreds and hundreds of times, it no longer captures the baby's attention and kind of goes on automatic pilot. Habituation research can be used to help us understand when a concept has become a part of a baby's repertoire. Because once a person is habituated or used to something, when it's no longer new, when it's already been learned, we actually have changes in our brain activity that can be measured. So language perception and habituation to what's going on around the infant can be measured through brain waves, and it's an indication of how much they've learned. Now let's look at a couple of the stages of communication and language development in infancy and toddlerhood. I'm just going to review a few of these. I'd like to direct your attention to the written parts of the chapter and also to the participation activity for this chapter. What we've done is we've pulled together a series of short video clips that illustrate for you each of these different stages of language development. And in the activity, you'll watch the clip, and then you will note what you observe behaviorally in that communicative act. I think that activity will go a long way towards demonstrating the content that I'm about to review orally here. So the first stage of language development that I want to talk to you about is babbling. Which is an extension of cooing. You'll see some examples of cooing, which are basically undifferentiated sort of crying sounds. Babbling involves a repetition of certain syllables, usually syllables that are easy for the developing motor system to pronounce, such as ba 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 or da 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 or ma ma ma. In fact, it's not really an accident that some of the most common first words are mama or dada. That's because mama is one of the simpler acts to create with your lips and your mouth. When you think about where you have to push the air to get the voice to sound and what you have to do with your mouth, mama involves simply bringing your lips together and pulling them apart. One of the simplest motor movements, often leading to the first word being mama. The word dada involves actually higher level motor skills where you have to isolate the tongue and pull it up against the back of the teeth to create that sound. So babbling is the stage where the baby is practicing repeating these syllables that are easy to form. And between about 6 and 9 months, you get a lot of this repetitive sound making. Babbling is a part of what we would call experience expectant development, meaning that what's going on around the child, the inputs that happen around the child are going to guide the development of this skill. So it's something that will happen based on the baby's experience, and that's why it's really important to create enough interesting activities around the baby that you can encourage this development of sound play. This babbling, playing with syllables, begins to sound like the language the baby heard around her family by about 1 year of age. Language becomes more purposeful as we get older. So one of the things that we have learned as a field that helps promote really strong language development is to introduce sign language or simple gestures to demonstrate to the developing baby before they have the ability to make their mouth move in complex ways and form words. We want to teach the baby that you actually have some power here. You can communicate what it is you want from the world by doing a simple motor action. And since the baby's lips and mouth aren't quite ready to do the complex motor actions of words, we will often use a simple sign like the sign for more that you see on this slide here. Babies can learn the association between doing a behavior, in this case a communicative gesture, making their hands into the sign of more, and then getting more of what they want from their environment. This is an incredibly amazing moment in human development, when the baby realizes that she has something in her power that she can use to act on the people around her. Whereas the developing infant often just used an undifferentiated cry to let caregivers know that they're unhappy. Either they're hungry, or they're tired, or they're just cranky. It can be hard to know what different cries mean. As the baby gets older and recognizes, wow, if I bring two hands together and I look at my mom, she knows I want more of that delicious food, then I get more. That creates this reinforcing, or Piaget would say, circular reaction, so that that behavior of communication is going to be reinforced by getting what you want. This can be particularly important when the baby is between the age of 12 and 24 months. Because what often happens in that time, we often talk about it as the terrible twos, the baby has begun to get some firm preferences. He or she knows what he or she wants, but may not have a way of acting on the environment to get what they need. So what do? They may tantrum a lot, or act out, or behave inappropriately, just because they lack an appropriate communicative action to get that need met. So early on, you can introduce these very simple motor movements. We might call them sign language, we might call it gestures, but it teaches that infants can use this new skill of sending a message to get a need met. Now, another really important part of verbal language development is developing a vocabulary of these gestures. All infants use gesture, which is basically using your body to send a signal. Some gestures are what we call idiosyncratic, meaning the baby has stumbled upon a certain motor movement, the adults take that motor movement to mean something specific, and they always react in the same way. They've created an association between a motor movement and an action. I think, for example, of my nephew. He would pull on his ear in a certain way, and his mom would say, "Oh, you want cuddles?" And she'd pick him up and hug him. So when he wanted to be held, he learned to pull on his ear. When she didn't attend to it, he would actually put his body and head right in front of her line of vision and pull on his ear. It was a communicative, idiosyncratic gesture that he had developed. Other gestures are more universal and tend to be understood across cultures. For example, pointing, where the infant extends the arm and the hand with a couple of fingers probably loosely spread out, and sort of reaches toward something that they want, but they hold the hand up, so there's a distance between the hand and the object, and that usually demonstrates interest, either wanting to show something to the adult, to point it out, or because they want it, they want to possess it. Early on, the hand is sort of floppy and the point is not very specific. But as you get to about 14 months, you often see one index finger becoming a more pronounced and more specific point. And babies are increasingly able to use these gestures to indicate what they want from their caregivers. In my field, working in autism identification, one of the earliest signs of autism in a developing child is a failure to develop a point. Young children with autism don't seem to have the nonverbal communicative behaviors in their repertoire that children without autism come to easily instinctively. So there appears to be an instinctive aspect to nonverbal communication that helps us develop verbal language. And young children with autism often lack these nonverbal fundamentals to later language development. So a child who is not pointing to things to indicate interest by around 14 to 16 months could be at risk for autism and is often recommended for a screening. A child who is not able to follow an adult's point to an object is also of concern, because one of the quickest ways that babies and toddlers and preschoolers learn what words mean is by pairing an adult's pointing to an object and then naming that object. So we need to both be able to point to indicate our interest and understand that when other people point to things, the next word you hear is associated with that object. These nonverbal behaviors are absolutely essential for developing a flexible language system. So early on, we have infants playing with sounds. They repeat a lot of common sounds and they do a lot of vocal play. They explore a lot of different sounds. By about 1 year or 12 months, most infants typically speak a handful of words. Between about 6 and 15 months, babies understand many more words than they are able to produce. So in typical development, receptive language skills, understanding communication, comes first. And then the ability to express yourself builds on that receptive ability. For some children with different developmental disorders, particularly those that impact language, you can end up with the opposite pattern. There's a condition called aphasia, where a person's brain is not prepared to understand language, and they actually express language at higher levels than they understand, which is really baffling to scientists until they learned that there was basically an entirely different process underlying this disordered course of language development, where the expressive words were learned through a sort of reinforcement. This combination of sounds appears to be linked with this object, therefore I need to use that combination of sounds when I want that object. So kids with aphasia can learn to express themselves at higher levels of sophistication than they can understand the language of others. And that's very baffling to teachers and parents, because you assume that when a person is using full sentences, for example, that they can understand full sentences. But that's not always the case. So problems in receptive language, problems in language understanding have lots of different variations and origins, but one aspect of them can be difficulty understanding how different segments of sounds, what we call phonology, actually work together. And it turns out that dyslexia, which is actually a language-based disorder in reading, it has nothing to do with visually turning letters around or reversing them. Dyslexia is all about a phonological or a sound system processing problem, such that individuals with dyslexia show that phonological problem when they're trying to learn to read, but they have actually had to work harder to understand spoken language across their lifetimes. So language learning is very complex. We often just talk about the things that people learn how to express, but it's very important that we also consider when and how we learn how to understand the language around us. So by around 12 months, we start to hear what we call hollow phrases. These are basically truncated phrases that mean things to a particular infant. So they're not using great grammar, they're not speaking in full sentences, but they might say things like get ball or up baby, meaning pick me up. These vocalizations can mean certain things to certain children in addition to being kind of universally shared. Once a baby's spoken vocabulary reaches about 50 words, which is usually between about 12 and 15 months, the vocabulary just builds in a crazy fast way at a rate of approximately 50 to 100 new words per month. So with this sort of naming explosion, we know that nouns are learned first, It takes a little bit longer to learn a variety of verbs and adjectives, but 20-month-olds usually say about twice as many words as children who are just 3 months younger than them. This growth in expressive language is absolutely remarkable. Now, language learning is a complex process, and there are many different theories about how it occurs. And it does seem that there are cultural differences in how we learn language, even though these nonverbal aspects tend to occur in a similar developmental sequence across cultures. So the universals of infant communication have to do with the social aspects of learning language and the exploratory aspects, where you need to explore and learn from the people around you. One of the ways that language learning can be encouraged, both by building brain connections and by encouraging this back and forth interaction between developing child and adult, is by using music. Music not only helps lay down the brain architecture for language, but creates opportunities for expressing and listening. In language learning, we also have cultural differences in grammar, which basically you could think about as the rules of the structure of like the order that you put words in and how you're going to handle things like plurals and tense and that sort of thing. So there are going to be an awful lot of grammatical errors in the developing child, and some of these errors are actually to be expected developmentally. And you get better and better at using the grammar or the structures or the rules of the culture around you with practice. So one of the ways that speech language pathologists look at the complexity of a child's language is to talk about something called the MLU, which is the mean length utterance. This basically correlates with the length of a child's sentences, the length of an utterance that a child uses on average. So as you get better and better at producing longer and more complex utterances, your grammar usually improves. Now, one of the theories of language learning is a behavioral theory, where Skinner and colleagues would suggest that there's no internal structure for language in their view. Infants are a blank slate and need to be taught language through experience, where utterances of the infant and toddler are followed by certain behaviors on the part of the caregiver. That's how sounds and words gain meaning, by being reinforced or associated with things in the environment. So to Skinner and other behaviorists, what parents do, what teachers do as far as setting up opportunities for the developing child to hear language is really, really important for their language development. In this behavioral theory, it's critical to repeat words on a daily basis, so that the more you talk around a child, the more you read to a child, the more proficient the children become in language. So in a behavioral model, caregiver involvement in setting up a language-rich environment is absolutely critical for language. In fact, there's a couple of very famous studies that talk about the responsiveness of parents and how much that impacts an infant's development of language skills. So what you find is that when a parent, in this chart, the mother specifically, responds to an infant's attempts to communicate at a pretty high rate, acknowledging that communication, trying to follow it up with something meaningful that suggests that they know that the infant is trying to tell them something, that responsivity in the parents is associated with rapid increases in the baby's vocabulary. So the environment around the child, how much language they're exposed to, is a really important factor in developing solid language skills. Data like this really reinforce the behavioral theory that what's going on around the person, the nurture aspect of things, is what drives language development. Alternatively, there's a theory that it's actually our social impulses, our desire to interact with others, that drives language development. So the aspect of language that refers to its social use is called pragmatics. And pragmatics is the field of speech language pathology which works on interpersonal skills through communication. So it has a lot to do with things like conversational skills, that we all learn not only what words mean, but how to deliver those words in a way, check our listener for understanding, clarify our message if they didn't understand, and basically use language to mediate our social relationships with others. So in this more social or Vygotskian way of thinking about language, it's thought that infants communicate because they have this drive to be social, and that it's the emotional and social connectivity that underlies the development of language, and that speech, which is actually just a set of motor skills that allow us to express the symbolic system, which is the cognitive infrastructure of language, speech to a social constructivist theorist is simply motor skills that are shaped by our desire to connect with others and deliver a message that others understand. We get better at speaking when we can tell that our listeners understand us. So to these theorists, our desire to be social and connected to others is what drives communication. And the critical part here would be Vygotsky's idea that it's what the caregiver does to scaffold language development, to support language development, to introduce a lot of familiar concepts, but to also introduce things that are just outside that baby's understanding, that zone of proximal development that will lend itself to development of language, which is all driven by a desire to be an important integral part of your social context. Then there's a third theory, the last one that we'll talk about today, that has to do with the idea that, hey, language learning has nothing to do, they would say, with this behavioral stimulus response model, nor do they think it has anything to do with the social or pragmatic approach. Instead, in theory 3, the idea is that we are all born with this innate neurological infrastructure that can process language, that infants, in a sense, teach themselves how to communicate because we are built to communicate. In this theory, you hear about something called the language acquisition device, which is basically this mental structure that seeks to be involved in language. That's the theory that Noam Chomsky is most famous for. He would suggest that you don't learn language through this step-by-step reinforcement process, whether it's being reinforced by getting something you want or having a good social interaction. To Chomsky, babies are born as curious learners, and language is just one aspect of their brain's innate development. To Chomsky, language would occur even if there were no one around the baby to promote it. Now, this particular theory has some scientific support. We do see that the structures of the brain improve and mature in very specific ways such that language can be learned. But there are also some scientific studies, unfortunately, coming from natural experiments where developing children have not been around people who promoted language. Maybe they were abused or neglected or left without language inputs. Those babies and children usually do not develop a language system, which would suggest that yes, we may have this neurological infrastructure to support learning language, but we really do need experiences and inputs from others in order to become flexible and adaptable communicators. So which of these three perspectives is correct? Well, different scientists have different views about things, but in general, just like anything else in child development, there's probably a little bit of truth in each of these three theories, and that there are reinforcing aspects that occur, as the behaviorists would say. There are social contextual things that matter, as the social constructivists would say, and Chomsky's not wrong. Our brains do have to mature into this process, but all of those things have to happen. Enriched environments, movements, social interaction, and neurological structure for communication to occur. So I'll stop there. Could go on a bit too long about communication and language development in the infant and toddler years. I'd like to direct your attention to check out the activity where you will observe these different stages and hopefully get a direct handle on this mysterious process that so many of us go through. Thank you for your time and attention. This concludes the lectures for Chapter 6.